It started with the first pop, sharp, dry, unmistakable, and I felt the room tilt like someone yanked the rug out from under us. We were 3 minutes into the AP history exam when I froze over the middle of a sentence, pencil hovering, and heard that sound again from down the hall. Ms. Havorson, my teacher, gave that little laugh she always used when she thought teenagers were being dramatic and pointed at the giant rule on the wall. No one leaves once a test has started. I told her those were gunshots. She said, construction noise, relax, as if she was calming a class full of kids worried about squirrels. Max, my friend, went completely still, like he'd been turned to stone, and his pencil snapped soft against the page. Another series of pops answered from 2 doors down, quicker this time, and the intercom went from Mrs. Bradford's cheerful announcements to static that sounded wrong in the bones. A girl near the front, the one who always doodled little stars in the margins, whispered her phone number and then that her sister's class was in lockdown. She passed the text under her breath to anyone who would look. Ms. Havorson snatched the girl's phone right out of her hand like it was a piece of gum and said, "Give it back." 0 for distraction, and waved the rule book like a tiny paper sword. Her hands were shaking just a little, but she kept her voice flat and sharp, almost rehearsed. I remember thinking how small that gesture of confiscation looked against whatever was happening outside. Footsteps pounded on the floor above us like someone running on a drum, and then a scream cut through, not the thin, fake kind you hear in movies, but the raw, wet scream of someone who realized they were facing something final. People started whispering that the principal had locked down the auditorium, then louder that the north wing was sealed. Ms. Havorson walked calmly to our door and locked it from the inside, turned the key with a deliberate twist and said, "No one gets up. We have rules." She told us she wouldn't let anyone ruin her exam, like the test was the urgent thing and everything else could wait until the bell. I stood up before I fully knew why I was moving, because the air felt wrong and people were looking at me like I had a choice to sit and write my answers while someone out there was dying. I said, "You can't lock us in," and she said, "You're creating a disruption." I told her again, louder, "Those are gunshots." Max grabbed my sleeve and hissed, "Don't make it worse," like he wanted me to be small and quiet so nothing else would happen. There was a kid in the back biting his knuckles until blood showed, and a girl beside him was crying silently, mascara leaving tiny black rivers down her cheeks. The room smelled like paper and fear, that hot metallic twist when adrenaline shows up. When we heard a handle jiggle 2 doors down, the sound of it was like metal on bone and it made everyone suck air. Somebody started praying under their breath, somebody else whispered, "Get down," and slouched over their desks like we were all supposed to become invisible. Ms. Havorson stood in the aisle, hands on her hips, and told anyone who wanted to leave to sit back down or deal with consequences. She told us the rules were rules because they kept order, because teachers got fired over breaks in protocol, because some principal once lost their job. Nobody brought up the fact that we were teenagers whose parents trusted us to come home. I remember the way the intercom stuttered and then died, how that silence made the pops outside seem closer, like teeth clicking near the mouth. My heartbeat sounded like a drum roll, loud in my ears, and I thought about the hunting trips with my dad when I was 13, the sound of rifle reports in the woods that taught me the difference between a firework and danger. I felt like I was the only one in the room who had that map in his head, that muscle memory that recognized the cadence of a shooter. So when the door 2 rooms down started rattling again, when we heard muffled shouts and then a wet, terrible thump, I realized the rules on the wall didn't matter if we didn't get out. I told Ms. Havorson one more time, "We have to go now," and she looked at me like I had insulted her with wet paint. She said, "If you leave, you'll fail." And then, without any more words, she planted herself in front of the door as if her body could be a barrier to the world outside. People were looking at each other, waiting for permission or for someone else to break the stalemate, and I could feel the air getting thin with the kind of fear that makes you either freeze or move so fast you don't remember doing it later. I saw Max's face white, and I thought, if this is how we go out, it isn't on my watch. I couldn't accept being trapped. The thought of sitting quietly while something came down the hall felt like consenting to a sentence. The knob rattled hard 2 doors over and heavy boots tested the corridor like a predator checking windows. I grabbed a metal chair, the kind that squeaks and left scuffs on gym floors, and dragged it across tile that suddenly felt slippery with sweat. My hands tore at the safety glass until it spidered and then exploded outward. And when it did, I heard 20 bodies letting out a sound somewhere between a cheer and a scream. I hurled the chair through the jagged hole and leaned out of the frame, yelling, "Out, get out now," like I had any authority to give orders. Some kids froze, their faces white as paper, but others moved like someone flipped a switch. They flowed past Ms. Havorson, who had planted herself 2 steps inside the doorway, clutching her gradebook to her chest like it was a talisman against chaos. She screamed at us, "Suspend them, property damage." And her words hit like small, stupid pebbles against the urgency of bodies streaming toward the roof. Someone shoved past her. Another kid half-pulled a girl in a hijab by the sleeve. I grabbed Max by the arm and ran. We were already on the cafeteria roof in what felt like a minute but was probably less, helping kids shuffle to the edge and drop the 8-foot gap down to the loading area below. I could feel the lip of the roof bite my palms as I hauled another student over, ankle twisting and all. Max and I guided them down, one by one, into a pile of jackets and backpacks that had been abandoned in the panic. No one stopped to pick up phones or study guides. They fell from hands and hit concrete like dead leaves. I shouted, "Leave everything, just get down," and the message seemed to reach through the fear. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. Back inside, I heard Ms. Havorson still yelling about suspension and damage and rules, her voice shrinking in the wind as more kids escaped. At one point, she lunged at the window and banged on the glass like she could demand the world to stop for her test. I remember seeing mascara tracks on her cheeks and thinking how weird it was that her fear showed up as the same as everyone else's, but that she kept arguing with the wrong thing. People climbed down ropes we fashioned out of gym mats and belts. Others jumped and landed in a tangle, groaning but moving. One teacher, Mr. Alvarez, the PE coach, met us at the bottom and started stacking bodies away from doors, barking orders like he'd done this 100 times and never wanted to again. We left backpacks and phones behind because there was no time for possessions to matter. Kids kept asking if someone saw their sibling's name in a text. Nobody could give an answer. I tucked a water bottle into my shirt pocket and found a scrap of paper with half an answer to question 12 on it, then crumpled it into my fist and threw it away like it was a bad dream. Max's hand shook so hard when he climbed down that he almost dropped a girl. I clamped my fingers around his wrist and told him to breathe, slow breath now, like one of those training tapes. He nodded with wet eyes and then started checking faces, counting heads like a soldier. There were a few seconds when it felt like the world held its breath. In that silence, I could hear the distant thud of boots again and then a different noise, like something soft hitting a wall, a thump that made the concrete above us hum. Someone in the crowd started praying aloud and another kid shouted, don't look," as if we could all will ourselves invisible. I thought about the hunting trips with my dad, the way he taught me to move without sound and to trust the way the woods smelled when something was wrong. That knowledge felt ridiculous in a school hallway but true at the same time. My body was making decisions before my brain caught up. Later, when I watched the security footage that the detective showed at the hearing, it felt like watching someone else's life. The video showed a figure in the hall, shoes heavy, moving toward our wing. Time stamps scrolled across the bottom and they made everything cold. 43 seconds from when the last kid dropped to when the shooter reached our stretch of lockers. 43 seconds of kids scrambling over a roof, of teachers yelling, of a chair smashing safety glass. Those seconds turned into a barrier the shooter couldn't cross fast enough, and each one of them became more important than any bubble on a test. Detective Ortiz said those seconds changed the outcome, and I kept seeing the numbers flash in my sleep like lights counting down. When we finally got clear of the building, the world felt very loud and very small at once. Sirens began to scream in the distance, and police cars pulled up with lights that painted everything red and blue. I remember looking back at the school and thinking about what happened inside. A locked door, a minimized email, a teacher who chose rules over lives, and a bunch of kids who decided rules weren't worth dying for. Max put his arm around my shoulder and said, "You did good." And I wanted to laugh and throw up at the same time because it felt like both a baited compliment and the truest thing he'd ever said. We had left backpacks, phones, and papers behind, but we carried each other's panic and the weight of what we'd done. I remember the question he opened with like a knife. "Do you understand how close this was?" Detective Ortiz sat across from me with a laptop and a manila folder and didn't waste words. I told him I understood, but my voice sounded thin and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. He clicked through footage and files while I watched timestamps crawl across the screen like a cruel clock. I'm a man who tells stories, and that day the story felt too raw to shape, but I tried to keep steady for everyone in that room who needed to know what had happened. He put the folder on the table and slid a sheet out, and when I saw the scrawl my stomach turned into tight knots. The shooter had a list, he said, and our room was circled. I could feel the ink on the page through the phone screen like fingerprints on a window. Detective Ortiz pointed out a crude sketch labeled with desks and excess that matched our seating chart, and my name was somewhere in the margin of the thing that had been drawn up like a plan. I remember the air in the room going thick, and how the chair beneath me felt both too real and like something I might fall through. Then he showed us the notebook page where 412 had been written over and over like a prayer or a sick mantra. My hands shook when the sheet came up and I had to look away because the repetition made my head spin. The detective didn't dramatize it. He set facts down in front of us and let them do their damage. He said the shooter expected us to be trapped by exam rules, that those rules were folded into his plan like hinges on a door. Hearing it said plain made it uglier somehow, like learning there was a second trap no one told you about. We went through the logs next, server timestamps, intercom recordings, and the district announcement system that had been knocked out in the first minute. Detective Ortiz explained the technical bits slowly because the math mattered. The PA system had been cut, leaving only that static we heard in class, a dead voice box when we needed to hear something that would have told us to lock down or go. I replayed the static in my mind like an insult, something that mocked the fact we were trying to be children in an adult problem. The hard truth was that when technology failed, human decisions mattered even more. Then came the piece nobody expected. Ms. Havorson, teacher, had received the active shooter email on her computer, Ortiz said, and instead of acting, she minimized it. A screenshot appeared on the screen, a snapshot of her desktop with the red urgent message tucked neatly into the lower corner like something she didn't have time for. Detective Ortiz set the timestamp beside it and I felt my throat close. It was 3 minutes before I broke the window. 3 minutes that could have changed everything if that email had been taken seriously instead of buried under complaints about construction noise. Seeing that screenshot made the rules on the wall look like paper armor against a real threat. He walked us through the clock of the event, second by second, and the numbers felt like weights knocking at the insides of my ribcage. The shooter moved, the door rattled, and minutes I had thought dragged past were actually the most precious things in the universe in those moments. Detective Ortiz didn't use the word hero to describe what people did. He used the word intervention, which felt clinical and true. He said our actions bought time, time that the shooter didn't expect, time that changed the math of death that day. He said the notebook, the sketch, and the logs all lined up to show intent, and also to show that rules alone don't stop bullets. People asked us later why we didn't let the principal or the teacher handle it, why we smashed a window, why we risked charges for property damage. The video and the files answered some questions in ways no speech could. The timestamped evidence made it clear. The system failed in layers, tech, procedure, and choice, and when a system fails, people get to decide. I sat there and let Ortiz lay the pieces out, because I needed to see them fit together to understand why I couldn't stand there and do nothing. It hurt to admit that breaking a rule felt like the only moral thing left. When the meeting ended, Detective Ortiz closed the laptop and looked at me straight on. He said, "You made choices that saved lives," and his tone didn't try to soften facts into praise. It landed heavy and complicated, and I kept thinking about the circled room number, the excess on the sketch, and the minimized red email. Those were small details, but they showed how close we were to a different ending. I left the station with the folder under my arm, and the image of that notebook burned behind my eyes. Knowing that the rest of my life would be measured in the seconds I helped buy and the seconds I couldn't. I went home and my phone exploded with messages that felt like punches. Congratulations, accusations, angry rants, and questions that wanted answers I didn't have. I, a man who always tries to tell the truth, read each one with hands that still shook from the roof. Some people called me a hero and sent memes and clumsy thanks. Others said I'd panicked the classroom and made things worse, blamed me for the broken glass and the damaged window, and demanded the school press charges for property destruction. Every notification pulled me back to that second when I chose to smash the glass, and I kept replaying whether the noise outside or my memory of hunting taught me the right move. The principal sent out an email that sounded polished and safe, full of phrases about following procedure and supporting students, but it said nothing about the alert that had been ignored or the fact the door was locked. That silence felt loud. The letter thanked staff for their bravery and blamed chaos on a single disrupted event, like the truth could be cleaned with a template. My dad printed it and put it on the kitchen table like evidence, and my mom stared at it like it was a riddle she couldn't solve. They wanted closure, and the principal's letter had the neatness of formality but none of the messy facts we were living through. Then Paige, student reporter, reached out and asked to talk. She came with a small recorder and a look that said she already believed something was off. She asked direct questions. When did you first hear the pops? Who locked the door? Did you see the alert on the teacher's computer? I told her everything I could remember without the flash of panic filling my words, and she wrote fast, nodding and asking for names and times. I told her about the minimized email I later heard about the rattling doorknob, about the way Ms. Havorson had clutched that gradebook like it was armor. Paige didn't act shocked. She just kept pulling pieces together like a person assembling a map. She dug after our talk the way people do when they won't let a story go. FOIA requests, public records, server logs, she filed them all like she had time and patience as weapons. Paige came back with copies of training documents that didn't match the public statements administrators gave at press conferences. The memo said one set of rules, the training slides showed a different set. The gaps were small but meaningful, like test answers that didn't add up. When she found the server logs, she called me and said, every teacher clicked that alert within 30 seconds, except one account sat on it. It sounded like a line from a bad movie, but it matched the footage and the timestamps we had seen with Detective Ortiz. Mac's friend and Bate classmate both told Paige what they'd seen. Max backed me up with the same steady memory of the pops and the locked door, and Bate corroborated the minimized alert because she had screenshots on her phone of the teacher's desktop clocked against the district time. When Paige presented the evidence, emails, logs, and those training slides, the narrative began to shift from students panicked to system failure. People started to ask why a red, urgent email got buried, why the intercom had gone to static, and why the door had been locked when students needed to leave. The facts stacked up in ways that made it harder to wave everything away. As the evidence piled up, the school put out more statements that seemed designed to slow the leak of truth rather than to fix the problem. Lawyers sent letters asking for calm. The district offered counseling and a generic review, but they didn't answer the core questions about timing and decisions. My phone kept lighting up with people who wanted to know if I would sign away my right to talk in exchange for quiet and some payment for the window. The idea of silence as payment made my stomach turn. My dad hired an education lawyer, and we said no to any hush agreement because the truth wasn't something we could buy or bury. In the weeks that followed, the files Paige uncovered became the backbone of everything we pushed for. Server logs showed timestamps that didn't lie, training slides revealed holes to be fixed, witness statements lined up. Each new document felt like someone handing me a sliver of daylight in a room that had been shut tight. I kept thinking about those 30-second windows and the one account that sat unread for 16 minutes, and I kept remembering the kid in the back biting his knuckles until they bled. The evidence was piling up, and with it came the painful clarity that we had been closer to a different ending than anyone wanted to imagine. They tried to buy silence with an envelope, which is the kind of thing that makes you feel like a character in someone else's bad movie. I opened it at the kitchen table with my parents hovering, and inside was a letter from the district offering to drop charges for the broken window if I signed a confidentiality waiver and my family paid to replace the glass. It read like a deal memo, be quiet and the problem goes away, and it smelled faintly of polished legal paper. My mom's hands trembled when she folded it back up. My dad slammed his fist on the table and said, "We don't sign away the truth," which meant we were going to refuse the hush money even before we hired anyone. My dad called Aaron Hale, education lawyer, the same night, the man he'd found through a friend who'd fought the district before. Aaron showed up with a calm face, a stack of legal pads, and a voice that didn't waste words. "Don't sign anything," he said right away. He put a preservation notice on the district's servers the next morning, the legal equivalent of telling them to freeze everything and not touch the files. Aaron talked about spoliation and evidence and timelines as if they were tools we could use to open a locked door. I felt relief that someone knew how to make systems obey the law. Aaron filed for records and pushed FOIA requests like a farmer turning up soil for roots to show. He worked with Thea, student reporter, who had the hunger of someone who smelled a story and didn't mind the dirt it would take to get it. Thea had already been digging into emails and training slides, but Aaron's legal muscle opened doors faster. The requests came back in heavy envelopes and zip drives, and for days we fed them to a laptop like a machine that might vomit truth. I remember sitting up late with Aaron and my parents, looking at rows of logs and screenshots while the house went quiet around us. Then Thea's FOIA results hit the table like evidence in a crime drama, but this was our real life and the stakes felt heavier than a TV show. She handed us a backup screenshot that made the room smell like copper in my mouth. There it was, Ms. Havorson's desktop frozen in time, a red urgent active shooter email minimized in the lower corner, while the teacher had a new document open complaining about construction noise. The screen looked ordinary except for the glaring contradiction, the urgent warning tucked away while she typed a petty gripe. Thea sat there and didn't try to soften it, she said, "This is the smoking gun." We checked the timestamp together, like we were reading a clock that mattered more than the wall clock in our living room. The screenshot had a date and time, 3 minutes and some change before I smashed the window. It matched Detective Ortiz's timeline and the server logs Aaron had saved. That number felt like a blade in my chest. 3 minutes that someone chose to waste on a complaint while an active shooter alert blinked red on their screen. The proof wasn't an opinion or a rumor. It was pixels and code and the cold hand of time. My dad went quiet and my mom started to cry, small noises that weren't dramatic but very real, and Aaron said the words I wanted to hear and hated at once. This shows she saw it. He explained legal options calmly, the way someone tells you which exit to take when a bridge is out. We can prove she had actual notice, he said, and that changes the district's liability. It wasn't about revenge. It felt like making the system answer for what it let happen and who chose what. The district's envoy called the next day, a practiced voice offering empathy and more gentle pressure to accept a settlement. We want to resolve this quietly, they said, like that made anything better. Aaron told them to stop calling. We told them we would not be silenced. I thought about the kids who had fallen and those who had left wounds you couldn't stitch with money. A confidentiality waiver would have sealed away the evidence, let the story evaporate while the people who made the wrong choices walked away unexamined. That was unacceptable. The evidence kept arriving, server logs showing when alerts were sent and when they were opened, backup images that pinned a minimized email to a timestamp, and training slides that contradicted the principal's public statements. Aaron filed motions and requests and kept reminding us to breathe when the calls and messages swarmed. Thea kept publishing pieces that laid the documents out cleanly and let the public read the files themselves. Each new document was a small victory and a new cut that stung because everywhere we looked the facts pointed to the same ugly line. Someone had seen the alert and chosen to ignore it. At night I replayed the screenshot, the red banner minimized like a sleeping thing, and I thought about small moments that suddenly towered. A teacher's choice, a lawyer's signature, a student smashed through glass. My hands would start to shake just thinking about the time I had bought with my chest and fists. We refused the envelope. We chose to push the file open and shine light on it rather than fold it into a quiet pile and pretend it never happened. That decision felt right and heavy and necessary, like walking into a cold room people had locked and saying, "Show me what you were hiding." The truth had a timestamp, and we were not going to let it be covered up. The hearing felt like walking into a war zone with a suit and a folder instead of armor and a rifle, and I sat at a small table feeling every eye press like weight. Board members read charges off a paper that tried to make my choices sound criminal, like they were dressing a life-saving move in legal clothes. My hands shook under the fluorescent lights, and I kept telling myself to breathe slow because every breath mattered when you were telling the truth to people who could call it wrong. I started like I always start telling anything important, plain and direct. "I heard the pops," I said, and the room got quieter like a face turning to listen. The intercom went to static, the door was locked, the handle 2 doors down rattled. I broke the glass and yelled for everyone to get out. I told them about Mac's friend and bait classmate and how we dragged kids onto the cafeteria roof and helped them drop down 8 feet. I tried not to make it sound like a movie. I said it like it was a list, because that's how it happened in my head, a list of things that pushed me to act. Detective Ortiz brought a laptop and a file with the shooter's notebook and the video timestamps, and when she spoke it felt like she was connecting dots with a ruler. "This is premeditation," she said flatly, and then she passed the notebook across the table so everyone could see the pages where our room was circled. I watched faces change when they saw the sketch labeled with excess where students had been sitting. The timestamp scrolled across the video and matched the seconds I'd felt like a rope I was climbing against. Those numbers made the room smaller and the choices clearer. Someone from IT passed around a screenshot of Ms. Havorson's teacher desktop, and I remember the sound of the paper moving like a soft drum. The red urgent email was minimized in the corner while a typing window showed a complaint about construction noise. When the screenshot hit my hands I felt cold, like I'd been handed the exact moment the pattern broke. Detective Ortiz pointed to the timestamp and said, 3 minutes and 14 seconds before he reached this hallway. The math of it looked ugly on the page, like it had teeth. Ms. Havorson's lawyer stood up with a slow, practiced breath and started a defense that sounded human and small in the face of what the logs showed. She was scared, he said plainly, and then she was confused and trying to maintain order for a class. He painted her as a person overwhelmed by chaos, not someone who had chosen an action. He said teachers had rules to follow, tests to protect, and a duty to keep kids calm. I listened and felt the room split into 2 stories, the one the files told and the one the lawyer wanted everyone to see. Board members asked questions that tried to frame my action as choice or crime, and I answered as I always do, honest and edged with the memory of sound. "Did you think about property damage?" one asked. I said all I thought about was getting kids out. Another asked if I had panicked. I said maybe, but it worked, people got out. My voice grew steady as the board read and reread evidence that had once felt raw and private. Detective Ortiz and the IT team walked them through the logs again, showing how the PA system went quiet and how the minimized alert sat like a sleeping beast on a desktop. Then the board went into closed session, and for a long time the room smelled like toner and old politics. People shuffled papers and the clock moved like a slow, heavy metronome. My parents sat behind me looking small and fierce, and Aaron Hale, education lawyer, rested his hand on my shoulder like he was anchoring me to a shore. I tried not to think about what closed session might mean, a rubber stamp or a real answer, and tried to stay in the moment where facts lived. When they came back, the verdict felt like a compromise gone wrong. Ms. Havorson received a 30-day unpaid suspension and mandatory crisis retraining, which sounded like punishment wrapped in policy, but they refused to fire her. They said they recognized mistakes but stopped short of holding her fully accountable. For me, they dropped disciplinary action and the threat of charges for the window. They added a formal commendation for my actions under extreme duress, which read oddly next to their refusal to remove the teacher. I sat there with the certificate in my hands, feeling relief, braided with a bitterness that didn't go away easily. On the drive home, my dad kept the radio low and didn't say much, and I thought about how mixed the outcome was. Changes that started but not justice that felt complete. People complimented me and criticized me the same week, and the board's decision tried to split the difference between discipline and accountability. I kept replaying the hearing like a film and kept thinking about those 3 minutes, the minimized red alert and the seats marked with excess. That day, the state of things was both fixed and broken, and I knew the fight was moving from that tiny meeting room into hearings, statements, and public records that wouldn't let the story fade quietly. Months later, the school looked different in ways that actually mattered, not just words on a press release. They installed redundant alert systems so one failure wouldn't leave us in static, and they changed policy so students and staff could trigger a lockdown when danger was obvious. Drills stopped being about sitting perfectly quiet for tests and started teaching evacuation, loud warnings, and common sense choices for survival. I walked the halls and noticed unlocked interior doors, clear signs for exits, and teachers who now practiced more flexible responses instead of repeating the old, "no one leaves" line. It felt like someone finally learned that rules are tools, not cages. I kept seeing small, practical changes every time I went back. The loudspeakers had backups, the PA system testing logs were public, and teachers had tablets that showed alerts in bright, unavoidable colors. Staff got crisis retraining that didn't focus on protecting a test but on protecting people. Students were taught how to get out, how to check on classmates, and how to make noise if silence would kill you. I watched a drill where kids climbed the cafeteria roof willingly because they'd been shown the way down safely. It was efficient and calm, not terror masked as order. Those things didn't fix the past, but they made the present safer. I started seeing Rada therapist twice a week because the nightmares wouldn't leave on their own and because my hands still tightened when a truck backfired. Rada taught me grounding exercises, feel the floor under your feet, name 5 things you see, breathe slow, and breathing techniques that felt like literal tools I could use when panic tried to strip me naked. "It's okay to remember," she said in her calm, steady way, "but we can choose what memory does to us." We worked through images, the sound of glass breaking, and the weight of choosing to act. It was messy and real work, and some days I left her office feeling small and heavy, and some days lighter. I tried to get my life back in little stubborn ways. I picked up morning shifts at the hardware store because I liked the honest work and the quiet of early customers who wanted nails and advice. Mornings gave me a rhythm: sweep the floor, stock shelves, make small talk about drills, and paint colors. I started running before the sun came up, feet hitting empty streets, breathing into the cold air until my chest felt like it belonged to me again. The first runs were shaky, full of startle reflexes, but the city waking up helped. I slept more nights without nightmares, slow progress measured in hours instead of panicked hours. A framed commendation hung awkwardly in the main hall, a glossy rectangle that made my face feel strange to look at. People stopped by and took pictures, some smiling, some whispering opinions. I accepted compliments about courage, and I let the ones who attacked my judgment slide off because I couldn't let every voice decide how I felt about what I did. The legal team negotiated counseling funds for students and staff and pushed for actual safety upgrades instead of performative ones. Aaron Hale, education lawyer, and the firm made sure the district paid for therapy, redundant systems, and a real safety audit. Money couldn't bring back what was lost, but it helped make sure others didn't have to fight as long as we did to fix things. We planted 3 trees in a small memorial outside the school for the students lost in other parts of the building, and the day we planted them, people came with shovels and stories. Families, teachers, and kids planted the saplings, filled the holes, and put little stones with names at their bases. We read names aloud, and someone sang quietly off-key, and the dirt smelled like rain and new things. It wasn't grand, but it felt honest, a place to touch and remember and keep from becoming just a headline. What I learned most from all this was that action matters even if it breaks rules. Sometimes rules help, sometimes they hurt, and when lives are on the line you have to choose people over policy. I also learned healing takes time, not a single moment or ceremony. It takes patience, therapy work, community action, and people who refuse to let institutions sweep failures under the rug. People called me hero and some called me reckless. The truth fit somewhere in between. I kept running, kept working, kept going to RADA, and kept pressing for changes so the next kid wouldn't have to decide between a bubble sheet and a break in a rule that might cost their life. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below, I'd love to hear your thoughts.